Now that the top has been glued, we'll go ahead and take all these clamps off. Remember, you need to leave your project in clamps for at least 45 minutes, preferably overnight. Once your project's done, you can see that the edge overhangs just a little bit, and that's what we wanted it to do. We want a little bit of overhang all the way around the edge. I'll show you in a later step how we're going to fix that. But for now, what we're going to do is put the plywood bottom in, and this plywood bottom should fit right inside your box. I found this piece of scrap in the scrap bin that's just a little bit bigger than what I need, so I'll be able to cut this one down to size. Now, a lot of times we're going to measure this to get the exact size, but this is one of those cases where we're going to try to work around the measuring. Math is obviously a great invention. We couldn't be where we are in the shops today without math, but it's very easy when you use math to make a simple mistake, and we try to avoid that whenever possible. So I'm going to show you how to do this without using math so that we get it to fit exact and that any little math error won't be a problem for us. We're ready to put the bottom in and cut it down to size. Remember, I've got this scrap piece here that's close but still a little bit big. So we need to cut it down to its perfect size. So there's a number of ways you can do this. The first thing I'd like to see you do is double check your box and make sure that it's actually square. In this case, this one came out pretty much perfectly square, and that's kind of a rarity that they come out perfect like that. But in this case, it just happened to come out perfect. So I'll show you how to cut it for a perfect square, and then also if yours came out slightly out of square, how to account for that mistake. Okay, it's not the end of the world. We can fix it and hide it so that people can't tell. But in this case, this one's perfectly square, so we're going to cut it down. Now, I could do this just by measuring. I could take my tape measure and stretch it across the gap here and see this one's like 4 and 15/16 inches across. So I could easily just set the fence to that, cut it, and call it a day. But there's something I like to do a little different on these, and I want this to fit perfectly in there. So it's easy to make a mistake on reading the tape measure, or if your tape measure's off a little bit. And so this way just kind of ensures that it comes out perfect. So what I like to do is just put my little bottom into the box here and have it sit perfectly flat the way it's supposed to sit. And while it's doing that, I'm going to put a line here that marks where the edge of the board is. And off of that line, I'm going to set the fence just a hair bigger than what I need it to cut. So I set the line perfectly, and I'm going to cut it just a hair bigger than what I need. Okay? And you can always cut more off, but you can never glue the shavings back together into a board. So it's always better to start a little bit big. So you'll probably see me cut this 2 or 3 or 4 times to get it to come out perfectly, and that's okay. It's not a big deal. Again, remember, it's better to cut more times and have it come out perfect. So I had to cut that a few more times than normal. Typically, if I wasn't on a video, it'd probably take me 2 or 3 times of adjusting it. I try to shoot for 3 because I'd like it to be a good fit. In this case, I did it a few extra just to make sure and kind of show the point. It's okay to do an extra cut or 2. It only costs you a few seconds. That's not a big deal to get a perfect fit. So now that I've got it cut to width, now I need to go cut it to length, and that'll be the next step that we go and tackle. We've made it over to the miter saw, and now we're going to cut this piece of plywood to length. So the process is going to be the same as before. I'm going to shove this thing all the way up into the corner, and then I'm going to see where the board stops and make a mark. Now, that'll be a little bit bigger, or I marked it exactly where I want it. I'm going to start a little bit bigger and then work my way down to a perfect fit. Once I get it down to the perfect fit, I'll show you what I look for in a perfect fit on the box bottom. One of the other things I wanted to mention is sometimes your box is not perfectly square. So if one of the sides is angled and this becomes a parallelogram, what you want to do is cut this until the first side of your board drops into the box. Okay, if you cut it till the second side and the whole thing drops in, you'll have made it too small. So what you want to do is cut it till the first side drops in. You know, imagine if my cut's a little like this and it's going to drop. As soon as one side of it will drop in, that's where you're going to stop, and then you'll have to touch it up with the disc sander. But for today, this one came out perfect, so we don't need to do that. The bottom has been cut, and I wanted to show you what I look for in perfection on this. So if you look, I try to get the spacing of one piece of paper on each side of the bottom is what I consider perfect spacing. This bottom will expand and contract as the temperatures change and the moisture content in the air changes. And it's one of the biggest problems we deal with in woodworking is that expansion and contraction. And a bottom piece or the center of a cabinet door, the expansion and contraction can actually break the box apart or the cabinet door apart or a door frame. It can break those apart. It has a very powerful force to it. So we always want to leave a little bit of room for expansion and contraction. And again, what I shoot for is about one paper's thickness on both sides. And if you look on the width here, I have a one thick piece of paper on this side spacing it, and I folded this one in half. I cannot get this one to drop in there. So this one I would consider perfectly spaced on the width, but on the length, I would say I did a poor job. It can fit a folded piece of paper on both sides, and I consider that a little too much. Now, is it going to matter? Is it going to affect this project in any ways? No, it just looks like there's a little bit more of a gap there when I glue this thing in. And we always try to work on perfection, so that's why we take our time and try to cut slowly. And with practice, you'll get better and better at doing that. But I just wanted to show you, this is what I would consider perfect. This one is, the cut was off just a little bit. Now again, a lot, no, not that big a deal, but it's a little bit more of a gap than I prefer. I would like to have one thickness of piece of paper on this box. Now, if this was a bigger project, I would probably need to leave a little more room because more expansion and contraction would take place. But on a project this small, and this being plywood instead of real wood, it's not going to expand and contract very much. So again, we're going to shoot for the thickness of one piece of paper space all the way around this board. In general, wood is going to expand and contract across the grain much, much more than it's going to expand and contract with the grain. So the width is always going to expand and contract. The length barely changes with the moisture content. Okay. We have arrived at the step of gluing in the bottom of the box. A couple of things I want to remind you before we do that is this is plywood. This is the first time we've used plywood in this lesson series, so there are a couple of differences with it. Plywood has a couple of thin layers on the top and the bottom, and then in between they'll have some other type of wood. Depending on what type of plywood you have, it might be like pulped wood, it might be wood that's laid in alternating directions, and there's several different types. We don't need to worry about that today, but the main thing I wanted to mention is we're going to want to sand the bottom before we glue it in, and because it's plywood and only has a very thin sheet of real wood on the outside, we don't want to sand all the way through it. So I would highly recommend just using the 220 sandpaper, that's the finest grit, to sand your plywood. That should be plenty to make it come out perfect, and that'll keep you safe from sanding through it and then having the ugly wood underneath show through. So when we glue this, you want your better side to be in the box and your uglier side up. When we glue this in, we're going to put glue around the edges at the rabbet, but we want to make real sure that we're not putting so much glue in that it oozes out inside of our box. That's one of the hardest things to clean up when you're doing this woodworking project. So as you'll notice, I'm going to kind of lay it on the side of the box to help avoid as much as possible from it going on the bottom of the box. Gravity will drop it down there for me, but I don't want it to do it too soon, so I'm putting it on the side mostly to keep that from happening. This mustard bottle's got a little dab of glue on the end, so it's actually a terrible applicator right now. I should have cleaned it first. So now what I'm going to do is just spread the glue out, and I'm going to be very careful to wipe up any extra. This is the area where I really do not want to see extra glue oozing out, because it's going to be a pain in the neck to clean up earlier, if I can even clean it up. So this will be a big test, trying to make sure you put the right amount of glue on. Remember, I want the entire surface covered, but not so much that it's going to ooze out anywhere. And in general, glue has about 2 minutes before it starts setting up, so you want to make sure that you're done prepping everything and are starting to clamp within that 2-minute mark. Some glues have a little longer. I typically use Titebond 2, and so that's got a 2-minute. If you do the Titebond 3, like I do often in my classroom, because it has a little bit longer set time. So again, I'm just wiping off any extra glue. The corners tend to retain a little bit, so I'm just getting the extra glue out of the corners. Okay, now that the glue's all set, we're going to go ahead and drop our bottom into place. And remember, we want to have an even space all the way around. And then, since this is such a small little device here, I'm just going to put a tiny little block here to spread out the stresses of my clamping, and that'll make it so I only really need one clamp. And I think I'll just add a second clamp just to make this thing balance a little easier. But one clamp would probably do it. So I don't want to crush the plywood, so this one I'm not cranking down as hard as I would normally crank them. Right now I just got it kind of tight, and then I'll just use a few fingers to snug it down. We don't need tons of pressure on this. The plywood's kind of soft, and it does have the ability to bend, so if we clamp it too hard, you'll just bend it out of shape. So just double check your spacing all the way around, make sure everything's where you like it, and if it is, you can go ahead and do your final tightening and call it a day.